A similar story to many others, my entrance to the world of survival horror was none other than Resident Evil. Growing up, I had a PS2, and somehow ended up with a copy of Resident Evil 1. That infamous scene of the turning around zombie became ingrained into my young psyche. I mentioned the fact that I had a PS2 because I did not have a PS1 memory card. What that meant is from the get-go, my siblings and I, our relationship with the game was established via what I'd liken to a European extreme difficulty. It was a single-run permadeath mode due to our inability to save the game. I became very familiar with the layout of the Spencer Mansion, especially that first half, having taken up the largest chunk of our playtime just trying to get to the guardhouse without actually dying. Funny enough, we eventually found our hands on a copy of Resident Evil 2, but again, still no memory card to save the game. Resident Evil 2 is the experience that my mind latched onto the hardest. The presentation felt so much more cinematic than RE1. The voice acting, the environments, the cutscenes, the enemies, everything felt so much more epic and so much more dire for the characters. I think the reason that the RPD as a location resonated with me so much is because it was so much more familiar in concept. You know, as a kid, hell, even as an adult, it's hard for you to conceptualize and internalize this giant lone mansion complex in a mountain range. However, running through back alleys of a street infested with zombies, meeting Kendo at the barrel end of his shotgun, and finally getting to the inside of the RPD, just to be met with even more anxiety, the framework of the world made sense because it could much more easily be paralleled with our own. Now, similar to RE1, because we could not save the game, it just made playing RE2 so much more of a struggle. Every single mistake was terrifying. I learned to be very, very conservative with the resources that have been given to us, even likely more so than other players might have been at the time, opting to run past as many enemies as possible in order to conserve our ammunition and health items. There were times I remember having rolled into a boss fight and the run would just end because without being properly prepared and aware of what was coming, we wouldn't have enough health or ammo to manage the fight. Or an especially frustrating encounter with Mr. X or a random boss like the Sewer Gator, they would just catch you unaware and you're dead. And I'm sure some people might ask themselves, why would you play a game that difficult? Why would you play something that punishing? Clearly, significantly more so if you can't actually save the game. And honestly, the experience at the time, for one, was, limited by what our choices of game access actually had been. But at the same time, the experience of Resident Evil was also so unique. It was so different than anything else that my siblings had any immediate access to. Considering our library at the time consisting of a lot of, multiplayer games, racing games, Mario Party, Resident Evil was specifically a special experience because it slotted itself perfectly as this raw, difficult, but learnable horror game. And of course, RE2 as an experience, not just considering the world building, but the characters were all so memorable, with the series' favorite prodigal son starring as his debut, Leon S. Kennedy. His first day on the job, he's thrust into a darkness which results in the longest night that only himself and a handful of others would even survive from, an apocalyptic event localized to an entire city and ending with it being bombed to hell and back in order to stop the spread of the T-virus infection. All of this is relevant because although Resident Evil 9 Requiem is the latest of over 24 entries into this series today, it is a direct sequel to Resident Evil 2. Well, at least Resident Evil 2 Remake. The modern retelling of the same events released by Capcom in 2019, which by then we had completely modernized that classic formula of survival horror for the modern age to an extent. And I think to understand why that matters, to understand why RE9 sits where it sits, we need to talk about the long, winding, occasionally painful road that even got us here. Let me explain exactly what I mean here. You see, Resident Evil 4, the original release back in 2005, did something both equally incredible and equally disastrous, at least temporarily. Now that hindsight is 2020, we can go back and know definitively that Resident Evil 4 is a masterpiece. The faster moment-to-moment action, quick-time events, smooth third-person aiming, hell, it had fun inventory management. How do you make inventory management fun? As we all know, it was well received. So much so that Capcom knew they had something special. So they made Resident Evil 5. It was RE4, but in Africa. And also co-op, dusty, and with every main character being hot. I mean, genuinely, even years later, RE5 is one of the most solid co-op experiences, period. I just recently finished a playthrough just a few months ago, and it, again, held up perfectly. Then things started spiraling. Leadership at Capcom had no idea what to do with the series, and I don't entirely blame them. We got Operation Raccoon City in 2012. Not terrible, but from the fans' perspective, not a Resident Evil game. Later in the same year, we got Resident Evil 6, which again, considering the gift of hindsight, the game wasn't terrible. But it continued to heavily divide the fan base because to a lot of people, myself included, Resident Evil 6 was not Resident Evil. The funny thing is, Resident Evil's evolution, near death, and what I would consider eventual rebirth, was a fairly straight line. If we just focus on the mainline releases and remakes, ending in the original PS1 run, we had Resident Evil 3, a game with a crazy high skill ceiling because it introduces an active dodge mechanic, among many other things, more items, weapons, crafting, the list goes on, with Nemesis constantly coming at you from every corner, randomly just jumping out at you throughout the game to hunt you down. It was much, much more action heavy than the prior two games. I think all of us would agree on that point. Code Veronica on the PS2, Resident Evil 0, and the remake of the first game on the GameCube were all considered to have gone back to a much more slower-paced, traditional survival horror setup. But even then, I would consider all of these games to have been much more action-focused in their identity than the original trilogy. Again, I think that's just a natural part of the series' evolution. My point here is that the series had always been barreling towards this more action-focused mindset, which made sense. If we distill the gameplay loop of Resident Evil historically, the dials are usually turned to various degrees across a few different pillars, right? We have exploration, combat, and puzzles. The degrees themselves have been tweaked constantly across the series from the early 2000s. If we consider that era and the general audience at the time, is it a wonder that Capcom made the decision to push towards a faster, more combat-centric design philosophy? Again, considering the immense success that both RE4 and RE5 had been, I don't even think they were wrong. However, even if they weren't necessarily wrong, if you play the games now, if you were to play the series consecutively from release, back to back to back, there's clearly some things that are being lost. A piece or two of the identity which you might truly consider Resident Evil on its own. Plenty of us sort of old-time fans could feel it, but it was really hard to verbalize exactly what had been lost throughout the modern evolutions. Did we need more puzzles? Maybe. Is there too much moment-to-moment combat? I don't know. Does it need to slow down? Claustrophobia, fear, focus. A mansion? We might as well throw that in too. Close enough. The developers at Capcom clearly felt the change themselves and were hard at work to reimagine the franchise, fueled by passionate fan feedback, but also likely some of their own pride and hopefully reverence for the earlier titles. They had a vision to bring Resident Evil as it was to the modern audience as is today. And in January of 2017, they made an attempt to do just that. Spencer Mansion meet Baker Mansion. You wanted zombies? Well, baby, meet mold monsters. You want horror? Well, we're in first person now. It's not hyperbole to say that Resident Evil 7 single-handedly revitalized the series. Some people actually found Resident Evil 7 to be so terrifying that they couldn't even play it. We're so back. With Capcom's newly built game engine, artfully called the RE engine, Resident Evil was pumped full of some juicy mojo. I would dare say the majority of old fans at the time were more than satisfied with the entry, and tons of new fans who weren't as interested in the then recent releases at the time were given a perfect jumping on point. See, Resident Evil 7 was effectively, spiritually, a soft reboot of the series. The game was full of completely new characters, new enemies, lore, and world-building implications, a new perspective. This was clearly going to be the avenue for the series moving forward, and it sparked interest into an exciting project that we had found had been well underway at the time. Finally revealed 1 year later in 2018, that would be the Resident Evil 2 Remake. Any potential naysayers for the first-person horror-focused design of RE7 were silenced immediately from that first gameplay showcase. Seeing Resident Evil 2 remade for the first time was like a parent watching their child walk across the stage to receive their diploma. Sure, we had some hard times, growing pains are normal, but as fans, we couldn't have been more proud. Third person, over-the-shoulder aiming, similar to 4, but slower, more deliberate. The RPD fully realized in 3D, Leon and Claire, both beautifully rendered and voice-acted. The T-Virus, Mr. X, Ada Wong, all of it had radiated this golden sheen that was the answer to years-long prayers. The clouds had parted, and we knew that if Capcom simply copied this styling, nearly tracing their design efforts from 7 and RE2 Remake, they could produce any future mainline or remake with confidence of extremely positive reception. Crazy enough, that sort of worked out. Sort of. Hear me out. Because considering the whole spiel that I just gave, what I'm about to say next is likely to sound a bit weird and maybe even contradictory. But I'm going to do my best to explain. So hear me out. Modern Resident Evil, what I would now consider every release after 7, that would be Resident Evil 2 Remake, the god-awful RE3 Remake, Resident Evil 8 Village, the RE4 Remake, and now RE9 Requiem. I would consider to be simultaneously some of the best and worst titles within the series. I have had a very peculiar sensation, a feeling brewing within me since playing Resident Evil 2 Remake and 7, and if I were to clearly and succinctly explain what that feeling is, I've sort of noticed that we've gone back and regained some of the best aspects of the original series from a game design perspective, but we've also made other areas of design notably worse, and it took me a while to really internalize what had been causing this, and I don't even know if I'm fully there yet, but a good bit of the issues that I've seemed to be having seems to stem from some of the, what I might call streamlining, as well as forcing Resident Evil as its identity to fit a lot of modern game design tendencies. And I definitely want to give you some specifics. So let's jump into examples of what I mean. Resident Evil 2, the original, on the PS1, had 2 unique campaigns. This was a carryover from the first game. Since the campaign was relatively short, the developers were really smart and reused a lot of areas and assets, but changed bits of the story presentation, events, and even characters and character interactions to be split across the 2 main campaigns. In Resident Evil 1, this was Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. In Resident Evil 2, we had Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield. To be short, the campaigns were similar in some areas, but varied drastically in others, culminating in a sort of true run or true playthrough. You had a true final boss and true ending that only became available by successfully playing through both scenarios, either in an A-B or B-A order. So, again, 2 playthroughs that would get you everything that you'd need for a complete experience. Though if you were a serious fan, you might then play in a reverse order from there, as you know, the game had certain events and item interactions from the first playthrough which would carry through to the second playthrough. 4 full playthroughs allowed you as the player to see every possible variation of interactions that the developers had accounted for. It was very well thought out and technically adept. Ultimately, the idea was really there to stretch the dollar of the original purchase by offering meaningful differences in experience, even though the core body of the experience was virtually the same. When I first played it, I realized that Resident Evil 2 Remake from 2019 tries to replicate the original experience of the two shared playthroughs, but if you play through the game, you'll realize that there's not really a lot that's different. You know, too much of the content feels reused between Leon and Claire's campaigns to the extent where the overlapping events and item usage between campaigns doesn't even occur. In fact, if you play RE2 Remake twice for both Leon and Claire's campaigns, you're going to realize there's a number of plot holes and actually sort of inconsistencies of events that exist because the developing team did not design the experiences of the remake to be different enough. The original game, again, had these two experiences wrapped within one. The remake has one experience with some small differences depending on the character. The differences between these two games is radically significant. I understand that the original design choices were bred out of necessity at the time, but I feel the loss of unique and meaningful choices and design differences has been felt fairly hard, at least, again, to me, in my experience. Now, it's possible that you're not fully convinced, so there's another nearly directly related example that I wanted to give, and that is the Resident Evil 3 remake. If I were to give the most emotionally charged response that I could give, it's that I think Resident Evil 3 Remake sucks so bad and exemplifies the worst aspects of the current series design philosophy. Considering all of modern RE, it was the only game which I'll pump my chest out and say I genuinely disliked almost entirely by the end of my playthrough. There was so much, a crazy amount of content they had cut from the original game. As in content from the PS1 1999 game that was not present in the 2020 remake. And I don't care how you spin it. Capcom should have been ashamed of themselves for shipping that game, as short as it was. And on top of that, the design of the game was extremely linear. Exploration, combat, everything. The most awful example of this was in how Nemesis was treated. In the original game, Nemesis felt like an absolute unit, an absolute fucking terror, because he had the capability to appear virtually anywhere in that game with no warning, and would relentlessly chase you and harass you. In the remake, he was delegated to one relatively short, but I'll admit, cool section at the very beginning of the game, and after a couple of reoccurring boss fights, the concept of his original purpose of design was just butchered. Now, you might be asking me, hey, patient, these just sound like issues with remakes in general. But 7, 8, and 9 are all new games. Surely they can't have these or maybe even similar issues. Yeah, I wish I could share that sentiment, but from my perspective, the new mainline entries have their own issues, which seem to be symptomatic of Capcom's newly adopted design focuses or design philosophy. Resident Evil 9 has actually cemented within me what I have been feeling over the past handful of releases are very much real and valid concerns, valid feelings. There's a handful of issues that I really want to spend time in this video talking about, and I hope that in explaining them, I can even work to better understand why I'm feeling this myself. So, with that being said, let's finally jump into Resident Evil 9 Requiem. Okay, first off, I did not like Grace for a while during my playthrough of RE9. In short, I'd say that while she did grow on me, there's still something just a bit off with her as a character. Now, she's got anxieties, that's a given, right? And considering she got a front row seat to her mother's neck being separated from her head, that's understandable. But Grace does show herself to be scared to take action in defense of herself and to save others, most notably Emily, a girl that you meet in the hospital. I do think that the game did a decent enough job of showing her as being fairly competent given the circumstances that she's thrown into. I mean, again, she is meant to be just this normal, non-action hero human being, right? I'd be curious to see how some other players felt about her, because I genuinely felt that ultimately I did not get enough of Grace's perspective in gameplay to really sink my teeth in. You know, to not be super spoilery, there's a section of the game where you play as Leon, and it's just this relatively large, open, explorative section with big action set pieces and BOW boss battles that, you know, we would sort of come to expect from that like RE4, RE5 framework, right? This comes after an initial section with Leon where you're sort of just getting the ropes with the new mechanics and really trying to understand how he plays. And then it just gives you everything that you would want in order to satisfy that itch of the RE4-esque action gameplay. I have no complaints of that really whatsoever. But where Grace was concerned, I sort of felt like a lot of her gameplay and really what the developers and the game was designed to bring to the table for her sort of campaign, if you want to call it that, her gameplay perspective, was fairly front-loaded. I was expecting a sort of similar, sort of symmetrical section of the game with Grace, where the world would really open up, so to speak, and sort of go crazy with the puzzles and maybe like a good like boss fight or two and some fun, spooky exploration. I actually think that Resident Evil 8 Village had a decent enough sort of exploration of the Castle Demetres, right? I thought that was fairly good. The Baker Mansion in 7, great, right? I was kind of hoping we'd get something along those lines, but more of that, expanded, open, right? And I just wanted more. I wanted more of Grace. And it was nowhere near what I was hoping for, to be honest with you. Some people might say that maybe I'm being a bit greedy here, but I don't know. I felt like there was a bit of a missed opportunity in giving Grace really just one major area to explore, right? I mean, there's another part of the game that you get to play as Grace, but like, it's not the same, and it's not the. It didn't even come close to sort of giving me that fulfillment of her being the survival horror aspect of this game. You know, there's sort of if we just take a step back and we just talk about her as a character, again, to not spoil, there's sort of a jump in her character from the end of what you might consider the initial act of the game, and then she just kind of shows up. It's like the writers just knew they needed to have Grace be at the final endgame area, but did not have a way to justify it as a part of the player experience. So they just kind of took her to the area off screen. It felt unearned. It felt rushed. I mean, a major part of any Resident Evil game, in regards to just sort of thematic elements, right, is going to be that shift from the dark, gross, decrepit environments that you start in to the more sterile, white, metallic walls of the then focused, evil pharmaceutical lab company, right? Insert umbrella here. I felt that only up until the end of the game, again, I had sort of finally been clicking with Grace as the character, and then I felt like I kind of had the rug pulled out underneath of me, and then I really didn't have another rug put back under my feet, if that makes any sense. I just wish I got a bit more of what they wanted to do there. And a part of me has a bit of concerns that I'll get into later about maybe why they did this, why they felt the need to do this. But again, especially considering that Leon himself is already so established as his own character. It just felt like the developing team at Capcom were so much more confident with his style of gameplay, which, again, I find weird, because say what you want about them not matching new modern RE to the original older titles, but 7 and 8 respectively had nearly nailed down a solid formula for a more horror focused exploration and puzzle sections. Not to say that RE9 did this badly, but I think it just did the bare minimum. It maybe was satisfactory. I mean, I just wanted more confidence in pushing into something new, something grandeur, something to really give Grace a solid position as a character, as a part of this, great historical cast of protagonists. And again, from the get-go, the foundation was there. Grace had this potential to be one of, in my opinion, and I know everyone loves when people say that, in my opinion, she had potential to be one of the more interesting protagonists that we would have gotten in this series, a true civilian perspective on the horror. But the game just didn't give her the room to breathe that I felt she really needed to get there. And some of the concerns and what I would say issues that I had with Grace sort of leans into or drives into this next topic that I wanted to touch on. And it's that I feel that Resident Evil, I feel that the developing team at Capcom has what I would call an amusement park problem. And so, if you'd stick with me for a moment or two, I can kind of explain my idea here of what this amusement park problem is and sort of how it rears itself, right? So this is a problem that I've seen rear itself across all of the modern RE releases, but I think it has done its most damage within the framework that is Resident Evil 9 Requiem. There's sort of a few parts to this from what I've gathered, and one of those parts is that the developers have a tendency to lean way too hard on cinematic or otherwise just forced interactions and scenes to try and supplement and force the moment-to-moment gameplay experience. This is something that even permeated into the remakes of 2 and 3, largely, actually, contributing to some of my biggest issues that I've mentioned with especially the latter entry. To simplify what I want to explain here, the developer's decision to remove your agency and control as a player in order to dictate a then particular event to occur. So this might be a, at the minimum, this might be a jump scare. This might be a forced transition into a new area, enemy encounter, or sort of play state. Whatever it is, it entirely removes the player's intent from the equation, and you are locked into what the developers decide is about to happen. Back in ye olden days, sure, there were seemingly random encounters and sort of changes that would occur to the world around the player. But most often than not, the event itself resolved in real time, with the player given immediate agency about how they would approach it. Think, Resident Evil 1, where depending on whether you're playing as Jill or Chris, there's certain sort of events that occur relative to, the being poisoned. So if you're poisoned in that game, there's just certain effects that can take place, based off of that, right? And it's you get a little bit of character interaction, and you might even, if you're playing as Chris, you might even get a little bit of gameplay interaction from there too, which, again, the game doesn't waste too much time giving control back to you as the player to ultimately make a decision, based around this event, this thing that has just unfolded, on your plate. I would say the most great relevant example would be Nemesis, again in the original Resident Evil 3. Again, he was a menace that would just pop up everywhere, right? You were constantly on edge, but when Nemesis showed up on certain designated screens, the game did not play some long, drawn-out cutscene of Jill and Nemesis clashing in hand-to-hand combat. No, the game gave you a very binary choice, and then you dealt with the situation as the player. At that moment, your input mattered. Your panic was real because the consequences of your own decision making were your own to bear. It's this strange phenomenon that I've seen in a lot of modern AAA games, which is this sort of focus on making video games movies, right? So you have really cool action set pieces and cutscenes, and even when none of that stuff might even be necessary. And here's the thing. I don't want you to mistake me focusing on this as me thinking adding this to a game is some sort of crazy cardinal sin, right? But it's more of a reframing of priorities and what I think a good mental exercise for developers to be. Does it serve your game more to allow the player more options to proceed through interactions themselves, or to passively watch what is effectively amounting to a walking sim, or again, a movie? An example of this, a perfect example of this within Resident Evil 9 proper, happens later in the game. So again, to try and be very minimal and you know, some people might consider this a spoiler, but it's a very relevant example. There is a section where you play as a child in an orphanage, and that entire section of the game is effectively just you as the player triggering, then watching very specific scripted events. As the player, all you are doing is just hiding under or behind boxes for 30 minutes, just waiting for the enemy AI to do its thing. It searches around a bit, then it leaves. And it gets old so fast. You're not making any meaningful decisions, you're not managing resources, you're not solving anything, you're not playing a game. Minimally speaking, walking sims are its own thing, but again, within the identity of Resident Evil, I don't understand what this is. You're just sitting there, pressing forward when you're told it's safe, and hiding when you're told that it's not. There's a version of this concept that can work, it could work, genuinely, but it requires the player to have way more agency, to have way more options for interacting within that environment. More risk and reward baked into the moment-to-moment sort of hide-and-seek game that's being played, rather than being led by the hand through a predetermined sequence of events. And again, I don't think that there's absolutely no place for these types of events to occur. They can be great for very coordinated storytelling, or sure, even cashing in on a quick jump scare here and there. I'm not opposed to that. But it's gotten to this point where it's being leveraged as a crutch. It's gotten to the point where this is being relied on way too much over any sort of emergent gameplay experience, and ultimately that just sucks. The second issue I have is related, and it's that Resident Evil 9, like the others of the modern titles, but seemingly much worse in this one, feels like it's doing its damnedest to drag you through too many areas way too quickly. I'd say the Baker Mansion in RE7 was relatively okay when it came to this. Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil 8, Resident Evil 9, they kind of all started to really peel away with this particular issue, where the game just pushes you through these quote-unquote levels or sort of missions, and it just feels off pace. It feels jarring. I know that other RE games, most notably the more action-focused ones in the past, like 4, 5, or even 6, have all had this more mission-based structure, and that's totally fine, right? The problem is that RE9 was designed in a way to attempt to mimic or force the more focused survival horror aspects of the series, while mission-based or sort of level-based gameplay is acceptable in something that's a bit more, moment-to-moment, action-packed. One of the key survival horror staples is to weave your world together so that the player feels a cohesiveness in the exploration of that world. It's the elements of the Metroidvania-esque world crafting, right? That finding of shortcuts to go back through to earlier areas. Oh, but now they're chock full of new enemies, new puzzles, and items that you can finally gain access to. That feeling of recognizing where you are, but from a different angle, understanding that sort of spatial, topography and geography of the game. It's what makes survival horror environments just hit so deeply if they've been designed really well, right? So it's sort of that difference between the Spencer Mansion, the RPD, I would even say the Baker House. These are places that have formed a sort of cohesive identity within your mind, a mental image, a mental map of that location, because of how well thought out and designed these areas were. But within RE9, you don't have that. You can't have that by virtue of the way that it's been designed. No longer is this one singular interconnected world. This is now disparate experiences that have been sort of daisy-chained together to guide you through the game as a game. And that, I feel, is a shame. I feel that per Resident Evil, within its core identity, that focus of environment, that focus of exploration and environmental storytelling is crucial to the player experience. I have another point here, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but I'm going to try to be very succinct in my disappointment. And it's that we have seemingly almost entirely removed puzzles from Resident Evil, and it just boggles my mind. I'm not sure if the dev team just thinks that every player is going to be some smooth-brained idiot, but thinking back, I can't really say that there were any full-length sort of logic puzzles within RE9. The closest I can even recall is a section of the game where you're needing to manage a sort of Minos labyrinth area, where you are opening and closing doors while moving a power cell or group of power cells in order to then properly proceed through to the next area. But even then, within that particular section, I struggle to call this a puzzle per se, because it was a fairly structured sort of linear experience. There were not really any sections of the game where I had to sit back and actually spend time thinking through a solution or just trying to even solve a digital lock. Puzzles are what I would consider another core aspect of that survival horror identity, right? Hell, puzzles are a core aspect of just horror games in general. I'd argue Silent Hill had some of the most ball-buster mind teasers across all of gaming, but Resident Evil itself has had some fun ones in the past too. Resident Evil 2, being the GOAT that it is, had a bunch of puzzles across both the remake and the original. There were patterns to reorganize, things to push, and riddles to solve. The puzzles served a dual purpose. They broke up the pacing of combat and exploration in a way that made you feel like these were more than just, hallways full of enemies, right? This was a world that, as funny as it could be sometimes, designed deliberately like real spaces with some repurposed and locked down mechanisms that required some fun random tool allocation or again random pattern puzzle to solve and unlock. The lack of these in RE9 again hammers home this push towards further simplifying the experience of survival horror within the gameplay of the genre. I think ultimately, again, it's a net loss. If you haven't played Signalis, it's an indie survival horror game which has some absolutely incredible puzzles. I would highly recommend checking the game out if you somehow haven't played it before. Honestly, I'd recommend the Resident Evil 9 dev team to play through that game at least once or twice to just get a good appreciation of what solid puzzles can do to enhance your horror experience. It's proof that modern players themselves can not only handle complex puzzles, but genuinely crave them when they are done well. Okay, so now that I've sort of gone through some of the things that I maybe necessarily had issues with, or just things I had some criticisms that I wanted to levy, I would be remiss to mention there were things that I liked about Resident Evil 9. Okay, so first off, just visual fidelity, right? The RE engine, right? What's known as the Moon engine has been doing some heavy lifting when it comes to visual graphics. I mean, everything just looks so good in this game. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's been a point really since the modern series launched with RE7, but it really impressed me so much when I was just sort of examining random items within my inventory, and I could tell that the items were just textured to near perfection, as in you could almost imagine how a particular object in the game might feel if it were real because of how well it was modeled and textured. It's a really weird sensation, but if you know what I'm talking about, it's absolutely amazing, and I just love the attention to detail, right? Like, my hat's off to the design team for the look of every character, each enemy, and the environments. I mean, they're all so well designed visually. I just love looking at everything in the game, and sure, yeah, there is a craft to the storytelling that's just happening through that environmental design that goes beyond it just looking good, right? There's the little details, the lighting, things are just sort of thrown into the corners that just give you a feeling about the space, and it just speaks to the fact that their art team genuinely cared about making the world feel horrific and just visually beautiful. right? Whatever issues I have with the game design, the people responsible for the visual identity of modern Resident Evil have been nothing short of exceptional, and Resident Evil 9 continues to have that legacy pushed forward beautifully. I would also be lying my ass off if I did not mention to you that I fell victim to the member berries with this one. Okay, so I'm going to post a spoiler warning and give you a timestamp to jump ahead in the video if you want to avoid this, because I will be talking about some what I would consider significant spoilers to the story of Resident Evil 9. Okay, so later in the game, as you're playing through Leon's section, you find yourself walking through the ruins of the Resident Evil 2 Remake RPD. And it just pushed all of the memberberry buttons. They play the music, they reference past characters, both directly and indirectly. The whole building just being dilapidated and destroyed, and certain little one-off lines that Leon's saying to himself as he's walking through the building. It just hit something in me, and I just couldn't act like I didn't feel anything, right? Like, I have a soul. I can't go through that and not say that I felt something, okay? I spent a significant amount of time with Resident Evil 2 in my childhood. A lot of time with my family, you know, crowding around the TV, no memory card, you know, absolutely terrified of Mr. X, walking through the ruins of the RPD in RE9, you know, seeing what would be familiar areas, but they're collapsed and overgrown. The main hall with its, you know, grand architecture and just sort of again, sort of having that environmental map, both of the original RPD as well as the remake. It was like going back to your childhood home and seeing it in an abandoned state. And I don't think that was an accidental feeling. I think they intentionally wanted to drag that out of me. And I didn't hate it. I did not hate the return to the RPD. And I thought using it to give Leon a bit of closure, even a Requiem, as the title has it, it's a sweet moment to be had in this game. And honestly, it wasn't something that I had been expecting. I didn't know that this was going to be in the game. So I'd say it hit even harder because it was unexpected. The game earned that moment. Whether you view nostalgia bait as a crutch, you know, that's fair. In this case, for me, Capcom stuck the landing. Maybe it felt a little cheap, but it felt like a farewell, and it did enough for me. So, I know that I mentioned my gripes with the pacing between Leon and Grace's gameplay sections, but I do think that Capcom has hit on a pretty interesting element of the modern series, which is worth praising. Resident Evil 9 is an experiment to attempt a blending of two very distinct, but two very loved experiences that the series has evolved to focus on. One being that action-packed zombie buster, the other the slow-paced first-person horror. Alongside this, within RE9 specifically, They have now given players the ability to change the camera perspective for each gameplay style, either third person or first person. This on paper sounds fairly inconsequential, but it's super important. I mean, perspective in games matters a lot, especially horror games. Third-person angles allow you to take in way more information about your surrounding area. First-person point of views inherently restrict and give you more of a claustrophobic view in nature, right? Being able to toggle these at your will allows each player to step into the experience of playing the game on their own terms. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's commendable. I have a very close friend of mine who specifically cannot play first-person horror games because the first-person immersion just pushes them too hard, right? So being able to change to a more dedicated third-person view across both experiences, both the horror and the action, allows them to more comfortably engage with the game itself, which I think is just, from an accessibility standpoint, an absolute win. But it's not just for the accessibility. It's an acknowledgement that different players will have different tolerances for horror, different tolerances for gameplay style relative to the perspective. So rather than forcing everyone through the same experience, Capcom has made a decision, at least within this game, to say, hey, here's a good bit of flexibility. Just find the version of the game that works best for you and play it. And that's just awesome. I would love it if more games did this. Capcom absolutely deserves respect for this decision. My hope is that the team has seen the positive reception of this blend and has hopefully gotten some solid feedback to refine this moving forward, both in regards to sort of that flexibility and accessibility of the camera angles, but as well as just the broader experiences themselves of taking that action focus or survival horror focus, right? Even if it's just to better understand the strengths and weaknesses across dedicated entries. However they want to take the series moving forward, I think the experiment was well worth the attempt because it ultimately gives them, if they're paying attention, a much greater understanding of what works and what does not. Data like this is hard to come by, and it's invaluable for a studio that is genuinely trying to figure out where to take their multiple decades-old franchise next. Well, for everything that I've said earlier in this video, I know I'm going to get some heat for this, but I like the crafting. Okay, both in Grace's and Leon's sections respectively, I can understand if there's someone who, doesn't like the systems because they are pretty simplified, right? There are these universal constant crafting materials. You have infected blood for Grace and gunpowder for Leon. As an example, there's no more extensive herbs to be found, just green. Combine that with the infected blood and you get a full heal. I like the idea of having flexibility that crafting can bring, building into what you need at any given time. It reminds me of the tension that you'd feel in the older RE games when you had to decide whether to combine, your herbs and your ammo and whatnot for some of that sort of more immediate relief and healing or ammunition, or hope that you find some other items later on to be a bit more efficient with your resources. I just think that the crafting system just needs... It's one of those system again that I believe needs to be stretched out a bit more than it is. It's definitely too straightforward and not extremely rewarding, but I don't necessarily think that the system, or just broadly speaking, the idea of it is bad. More so that my preference, again, would be to just add more options for the player for the crafting at any moment-to-moment, point in time in the game. Give me more meaningful choices, more trade-offs. Trade-offs are great. More moments where I'm just looking at my inventory, just torn between 2, 3, 4 options because I just don't know what that next room is going to throw at me. That's really where crafting in, broadly speaking, survival horror games shines. And Resident Evil 9 had a foundation to deliver that. It really just needed to be more confident within the depth of the mechanic. Now, with all of that being said, some things I didn't like so much, some things I had, just okay thoughts on. I do want to take a step back from the specifics of Resident Evil 9 itself for a moment and talk about something that's just been sitting with me, right? Not just through this game, but again, through the entirety of modern RE. And it's what I've touched on earlier, but I think there's a larger conversation to be had about what these games are ultimately trying to be versus what the originals were, and whether or not the gap that exists between those two things is a problem inherently, or if it's simply a reality of the medium evolving. So, again, the original Resident Evil titles were, for all intents and purposes, they were products of their time. They were products of the limitations of the console and the discs that they lived on, right? Fixed camera angles were not just an aesthetic choice, although they are absolutely beautiful. They were a technical necessity. They also just happened to create absolutely incredible tension. Tank controls weren't designed to be scary. They were standard for the era because no one figured out how to code and design movement pre-analog that worked super well within those fixed camera angles, right? The friction that tank controls introduced between what I would say player intent versus the in-game character's sort of movement response created an additional layer of anxiety that ultimately became sort of synonymous with the genre itself. Limited inventory space wasn't a design philosophy, it was a hardware constraint. The puzzle-heavy design, partially a way to pad game length in an era where games were expected to be beatable, ultimately in a handful of hours once you actually figured out how to play them. They needed to justify a price point. But the point isn't that the originals were accidental masterpieces. No, far from that. The developers recognized what had been working, and they leaned into them super well, consecutively, right? With Resident Evil 1 being the groundwork, Resident Evil 2 just further expanding on that, and then into 3 even more so. But the conditions that created those particular design decisions just don't exist anymore. Modern hardware can render massive, seamless open worlds. Modern control schemes are fluid and responsive, and modern players have been conditioned by decades of quality of life improvements. So the question then becomes, do you attempt to recapture the feeling of original Resident Evil survival horror without the constraints that actually gave birth to it? And I think the puzzle that Capcom has been trying to solve since Resident Evil 7, each game in the modern era feels like a different attempt at answering that very question. Resident Evil 7 says, what if horror is just about the vulnerability and isolation? And we use the first person to make you feel small, vulnerable, and claustrophobic within the Baker Mansion. RE2 Remake took that and said, okay, we will then rebuild the RPD, but we'll make it just a little bit faster, just a little bit slicker, a little bit more cinematic. Maybe a little bit too much, but Resident Evil 8 said, okay, we'll take the horror. It can also sort of be like a theme park of different flavors, and we'll even make that just a bit more action-packed, right? We'll give you a lot more options and customizations for your weapons and things that you can buy from the trader. Right now, Resident Evil 9 says, what if we try to take our now core gameplay styles across the identity of our series, the action and the horror, and we try to blend them into one package with two distinct experiences. Each of these has merit. Each of these has blind spots. And again, it's just that the blind spots keep nagging me because they're consistently the same ones, and they seem to consistently be getting larger and larger in scale. Less interconnected world design, fewer meaningful puzzles, more reliance on scripted spectacle over the emergent player-driven, moment-to-moment gameplay. We have, more diverse areas to visit, but less reason to actually care about any single one of them. I would say that these are patterns. These are patterns that suggest a design philosophy that has made a deliberate trade. We have spectacle, but we also have friction. And whether that trade is worth it depends on, really what you're looking for as a player, and ultimately what those sales numbers say for Capcom. And I think that's the most honest thing I can say about modern Resident Evil is if you're coming in fresh, say that Resident Evil 7 was your first Resident Evil game, you're probably having the time of your life. These are pretty well made, very polished, beautiful games. And they're fun. I, again, would be lying if I said that I wasn't having fun playing these games. But if you've also been here since the beginning, if you've been here since the PS1 days, if you remember what it feels like to be stuck in the RPD with no ammo, no herbs, no idea where to go, hell, no saves because you don't have any ink ribbons. Good job. There is a specific feeling to that experience that modern RE has not been able to replicate. Certain aspects of the experience has gotten close, but they just haven't gotten there. Not fully. And I don't believe it's that Capcom itself lacks the talent, but I just believe the priorities in design have shifted naturally. I really enjoyed Resident Evil 9 as a game. I think considering modern Resident Evil entries, it, again, exemplifies all of the good and all of the bad of where the series has been going. I do want to make the call out that the series has since evolved past its origins. These games are not ever going to be direct replacements for the originals because they are so drastically different in experience. And to some extent, if being a fan of survival horror is your goal, then play the originals. Slam it way out of the park, right? These are amazing titles, even paired up against these modern entries. They are incredible. That being said, I can't just write off 7, 8, or 9 as being a waste. They are different. Variations to the formula with strengths and weaknesses individually and grouped together that are constantly being shifted and tested by Capcom to see what works and what doesn't, what's being received well and what isn't. It's going to be near impossible to meet the feel of the original games with the sensibilities of our current gaming landscape. That is what I truly believe. Not impossible, but near impossible. Though I think that there's merit for these entries to do their own thing and ultimately push the series forward into an even newer, evolved identity. As someone who just enjoys playing video games, I, again, liked RE9. I can't say that enough. As a fan of Resident Evil, I have criticisms, but I think the point that I wanted to make here is that change will happen. But with some tweaking here and there, we could possibly get an entry in the series that's better than anything before or current. It's happened before. It can happen again. It's also possible that we get something vehemently worse. I don't know, honestly, and only time will tell. If you've stuck around this long, I genuinely appreciate you giving this a listen, whether you're a fellow Resident Evil fan, someone who's just curious about Resident Evil 9, or someone who puts these videos on in the background while doing other stuff. Your time means a lot to me. Coming up next, I've got some interest in a few exciting titles that I'm looking forward to diving into. I believe I mentioned previously, Crimson Desert has my attention. Also, Mouse PI for hire looks like it could be a really fun surprise. I'm also starting up Pragmata pretty soon, so a handful of things that we'll be checking out. All really cool games I'm really looking forward to playing and breaking down for you all. These videos will follow the same sort of similar long-form format that you've come to expect from this channel. Deep dives into the game design player experience and what makes the games tick. If that sounds interesting to you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon for notifications. And as always, I want to hear from you, so drop your recommendations in the comments for games or just topics that you'd like to hear me cover. I love all genres and all games, so really anything goes, whether it's a massive AAA release, a tiny indie gem, or just something in between. If you know it's worth discussing, then let me know. This channel is as much for you as it is for me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.